Pardesi Beats.
What's up, everybody? You're tuned into Pardesi Beats Unplugged. Welcome into today's episode. In today's episode, with it being the last episode of this season and also airing on the last week of November, we thought it'd be fitting that we talk about Men's Health Awareness Month. And more specifically, we're going to focus on a topic that is very near and dear to all of our hearts. We're going to be talking about mental health and more specifically, men's mental health, the stigma around it and all of that. Interesting stuff. I am M. Tadwal. With me today, I have Kushwant Singh and the one and only Patwant Singh. How you boys doing?
Good, man. My mental health is deeply shook right now because one of my favorite Manchester United players has been sacked as the manager. We'll talk about that another time, but shout out to Ole.
My mental health is good because Liverpool keeps winning.
Yeah, we can tell in the group chats when you just scream players' names, no context. He just yells the player's name like, okay, something's happening. As we've talked about, I know nothing about football. So mental health, I think it's a perfect place to start off, because when we think of mental health, we think of mental illness, and that is a really big, I guess, a confusing point for people. It's like mental illness, we think of things like depression, anxiety, and those kind of textbook kind of things. But mental health is something that we all have. One thing, and OG listeners of Pardesi Beats who used to listen to us on World FM will know this reference that I always make. Every Saturday, I would talk about mental health in some capacity in Punjabi, just to open the door for people to be more comfortable with the stigma that exists around mental health in our community. But one way I like to frame it is when we think of our physical health, if we have some sort of ailment, if something hurts, like our knee hurts or we're feeling kind of sick, we run. We don't walk. We run to our general practitioner or our
Providing
doctor.
that that doesn't cause us pain. Yeah, we do.
Yeah. But like that's our first instinct. Like we're going there no matter what.
Doctor la jo,
Doctor ko jana, right?
Yeah.
But when we think of mental health or even mental illness,
then we run to the liquor cabinet.
Yeah, exactly. That's not our first instinct. And I think that is a really big barrier that affects not only men, but in general, just mental health. So I think the first question I want to throw out there, and we'll throw stats out at you guys throughout this episode as well, just to highlight the importance of taking care of your mental health. But when you think of mental health, what are the first kind of things that come to your mind?
Well, for me, it's just like I've experienced some form of this because of some recent events that I'll touch on later. But I usually think when we think of mental health, there's two sides of my brain, as are many different bugs and drugs identity discussions. One is me as just a Western born Canadian, and then one is me as the Punjabi in me comes out. And to me, it's just like, I think, depression, I think suicide as an extreme, because we've seen that with certain people in our community as well. Here in Edmonton, there is somebody in sort of my network of friends, which they do a walk for every year. And, it's like a little bit, they bring awareness to mental health. So there was somebody who passed away a while ago due to suicide, and they do a walk for him every year. I'll leave that sort of out of this, not to put spotlight too much on that specific incident, but that brings me to sort of showcase that I think it's a huge problem, especially generally in men, and then specifically in Punjabi culture in men too. So for me, I just think in my head, I kind of see just a dude sitting alone at home, just drinking. And that's sort of my picture in my head. Not, although that's not everybody's sort of, the way they deal with it. So, but Kush, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just like a mindset for me. Like what mental health is. It's just how you're doing inside your head.
Yeah.
Could be good, could be bad. Sometimes shit, sometimes good. Yeah. And always changing, always evolving, something you have to kind of pay attention to. Because if you don't, like, just like physical things in your body, right? If you don't pay attention to it, it's gonna create like an injury, or something could break or whatever, right? So something you have to give it attention to, however much that is for yourself. That's dependent on yourself, but yeah.
One thing you just said is like pay attention to, but some people don't know how to even get to that spot to realize that it's something that needs to have attention paid to it, or how to pay attention to it for that. Like recently people have been buying fidget toys to help with their mental health, right? And this helps with mine when I'm driving, especially with Edmonton's trains. But like nobody's told like, hey, go to see like this person, or go see a doctor or a therapist or somebody to talk to, even your buddies. Like a lot of dudes do this. It's like an age-old thing where all the dudes will hang out after work in the pub or at the bar, and they'll have a couple of drinks and just ramble off what's on their mind. You see it in like Moloch's favorite show, The Simpsons. You see Homer doing it almost every day after work. Family Guy, Peter Griffin's out there with his buddies. And like it's a thing that's built into our pop culture that it's okay to do and it's normal to do. And then the things that happen there in those situations, if it's in Seinfeld, they're usually at the cafe eating their sandwiches and stuff. It's in every show, in Friends, they're at a coffee shop. It's sort of built into our pop culture, and I don't think we realize it, that talking to each other helps, but it's not highlighted in that sense. So, and then there's phone carriers and stuff that do like Bell Let's Talk, and I think the awareness is coming now more in the general culture. But I kind of want to pinpoint a little bit more onto the Punjabi community in this episode from my end, and sort of a general, what's the word, very specific situations where men are overlooked. And I'll get into that later, but I'll lead it back to Moloch before I get too rambly.
And I think the important point that you brought up is, when we think of mental health, the biggest stigma is like, oh, where do I begin to talk about it? Or how do I begin to talk about it? Or like Kush pointed out, it's like, it's something that you take care of here and there on occasion. And if you don't, before you know it, you're in some weird funk and you're like, I have no idea why I feel like absolute shit right now. No. But it's because I've been on this negative thought pattern, or I've been putting myself down, or I've just been high anxiety for such a long time. But the other really big thing is like, where and what do we talk about? It's simply just talking about it. I think that's an important thing, right? If it's with your friends, rather than talking about the surface level stuff of like, hey, I know things are tough. Yeah, okay, cool. It's actually getting down, like, and not everybody has a huge group of friends, but everybody has like one or two people that are very close to them.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be friends. It could be family too. But friends and family, there is a fine line. That
support system there. And and the wonderful thing about that, we talk a lot about it with suicide. It's like, talking about it is opening the door, and the hardest part is opening that door. So just having that conversation, if you're struggling or if you just have something on your mind, it's really surprising to see how many people are receptive to that. Like I've talked about, the stat is that 1 in 5 people in Canada will experience some sort of mental health problem in their lifetime. But the fact is that all of us have mental health, and it's important that we're taking care of it in some form. If it's talking to friends or family, if it's finding activities or coping strategies or things like that, that allow us, even if it's getting professional help. And I think that's an important thing that we should touch on as well, because there's a huge stigma around like, oh, a therapist? Why would I go see a therapist? I'm fine. And then we add in that element of being a man, and kind of like the episode title says, just man up, just rub some.
How many times have I joked with you about that as we've gotten older through time? I was like, it's banda lifetime now, right?
Yeah.
But obviously, no, you're right. And then there's things that people don't even think. They don't put men in a category of asking about how they're doing in certain situations that comes up in a lot of people's lives. So we'll get there, but continue.
I feel like that's probably a good transition. I know the topic that you want to talk about. If we talk about men specifically, mental health, it's like real men don't have emotions, or they don't ask for help, and that's like, if we're talking about anxiety, if we're talking about depression, if we're talking about other things involved, the perception is, and like you said, it's starting to change a little bit now, but it's still very difficult for men to come out and talk about what is going on. And another big piece of that puzzle is because the stereotype and this stigma has been present for so long, those individuals that are trying to reach out for help or wanting to reach out for help have no idea what emotions are or what managing their symptoms are. And their kind of go-to coping, as we've talked about, especially in the Punjabi community, it's like, I'm just going to shut down or I'm going to start using substances. And that's become a norm. If we talk
Escapes.
about,
Yeah.
if we talk about the Punjabi community, that substance use is a huge topic in and of itself. And
Yeah.
I think it's become normalized for men to be like, yeah, no, it's fine. You know, like, "Ghar da kaam chalda nahi, koi na," like, you just drink it off. And I think that is a really big issue in our community. But in
Yeah.
general, I think the perception is that men don't talk about their emotions. And if they try to talk about their emotions, there's no language for it, or they're not comfortable with it, because since they were kids, it's always been like, no, like, men are this way, boys are this way, girls talk about feelings. And even when we think of a lot of the health movement with women, it's very self-directed, and it's such a powerful and empowering thing, because women banded together and they've started creating these networks of communication and these networks of support that have shed light on women's mental health, have shed light on in general mental health. But for men, that's still very difficult to do, because as a man, being masculine, weakness is such a concept that's like, oh, you're going to talk about that, you're weak, and then that kind of ostracizes the man to not do that, and that's where kind of that toxic masculinity comes in. So I think when we think of men's mental health, it's really difficult to start chipping away at that stigma, because it's so deeply ingrained in every culture.
Yeah. That's yeah, like, just generally there's a general men's mental health, and then there's those that don't identify with being a man or a girl, and they don't know, like, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But there's the men's, let's just go with men for a second. The mental health thing worldwide, globally, beyond cultures, is bringing quite awareness to it right now. But then you see those subcultures like our Punjabi culture, which is like very masculine based, or alpha male, like every male needs to be an alpha. Not there, like, I mean, there's a reason there's an alpha male, because other males are not all males are alpha, right? So, but they're taught like, "Sare tusi bano idda." Sare, you know, like, everybody has to be that. And so it's taught in our music, in our culture, in our movies, in our urban legends, in our, you know, our historic cultural legends. And it's like, this is how you're supposed to be, right? So it's like, I mean, I think we can go into different areas and examples of it to sort of talk about it. But yeah, it's a very, people are scared to talk about it, and they feel like they'll get ridiculed, and by their family, by their friends, by, you know, society. They're even taught that, you know, just man up and shut up. And
we're talking about the Punjabi culture. What's the most common saying for males? Banda ban ja.
Banda ban ja.
Right? Like, when you think of that, it's just like, it's so deeply and it's so normalized that it's now become a detriment. Like, it is. We talked about it briefly with kind of that suicide. Taking cultural context out of it, 75% of all suicides in Canada are males, and like, that number is staggering. When we add in the cultures, and I want to tag in the Indigenous culture here, their stats are for males are like 10 times more than,
way worse,
right? So cultural aspects play a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Being a male, all that stereotype around that also plays a huge part in it. So like,
and
with
if
our
anybody wants a little bit more insight into the Indigenous reasons, watch our old episode with Amarjeet Sohi, when we're talking about a little bit of the Indigenous issues, and that he does highlight some of those things, which weren't only for males that are Indigenous, but it highly affected males that were Indigenous as well.
And again, like, we started this episode, we're focusing on men's mental health, but for us, we know mental health in general is such a huge and important topic, and that's kind of why we wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
And similar to our bugs and drugs, it's kind of creating that opportunity to talk about, or at least normalize talking about, a topic that you may or may not be comfortable with. Something
Yeah.
that we say in today's episode might stand out with you. Something that we say might spark a conversation with a friend of yours.
And it might even spark a controversy, but we're going to talk about it.
But the beauty of it is it's opening that door for conversation with mental health,
Exactly.
with men's mental health. It's the first step is talking about it. And I think to break that stigma, that's kind of, you talked about breaking the silence. That's an opportunity for people to
That's the name of the walk that they do from that organization.
to become more open about talking about mental. And there's so many, not only in the Edmonton area, but throughout Canada, throughout the world, that there's opportunities for learning and growth, both for men and other genders as well. And I think this is probably a good tag to kind of slide into, if we want to talk about our own experiences as men, if we want to talk about kind of specific issues or things that we've seen. I feel like being vulnerable is probably a really cool way for us to at least start to chip away at the stigma. We're three dudes talking on a podcast. It may not necessarily change the world, but it's still a ripple in the ocean. I think that's important. And Pat, I know you really wanted to talk about this, so if you're comfortable, I'll tag you in first. If not, I can go first as well.
Sure. And which one are you referring to? I talked about a couple of things.
Wherever you want to start.
Well, I mean, I can talk about a couple of different things where I can. I'm only going to speak on personal experiences, and this is not to knock anybody, but more so to highlight my experience in the situation, opposed to others' experiences in this situation. So all of you followers of Pardesi Beats know sometimes you've seen here and there a special cameo appearance by Kushi's favorite nephew named Himmat Singh, and well, Malik, yours too. But so I had a son about almost a year ago. He's 11 months old. By the time you see this video, he'll be 11 months old. And so the whole sort of stigma on mental health, this is general, and then I'll get into the Punjabi side of it too. But this is a general thing, is like, you know, after you have a baby, you have a kid, you come home, let's just say in a typical situation, or you get phone calls saying, "Hey, congratulations, how's the baby? How's the mom?" And, you know, everybody's asking, and you're like, yeah, and hopefully you're saying, yeah, they're good. You know, they're okay. They'll get through whatever they're getting through, but, you know, everything's going to be fine. And then at the end of it, they're like, okay, that's good. Tell them, send our love to them or whatever, like any sort of thing. When do you hear, and sometimes you do hear it, but when do you hear, and how are you doing as a dad? Now that's men's mental health in a form that one thing I can't take away from, for example, my wife or any other woman, is if they gave birth, whichever way that was, obviously the men didn't do that, right? But sometimes the situations that certain dads go through in those processes, because every birth is different, every delivery is different, every situation is different, baby's health, mother's health, dad's mental health during that time, because it could be a very stressful time. It's all subjective to the individual and sort of, I guess you can say, groups that experience it, or families more so in this context. But nobody cares about, I felt like even in the hospitals, nobody cares about the guy. You know, like you're sitting there laying in the hospital. Like I was in the hospital the day, obviously Himmat, he's my son's name, Himmat was born. And I'm like lying on the chair, like, oh, like I got no sleep, right? And I was just like laying in this chair with a stool on my feet, trying to catch like a couple hours of sleep, because I'm also going through it, right? Obviously, I'm not, you know, going through the actual pain of the labor and that experience, but mentally being there, experiencing that, hoping that everything is good, right? And everything was good, but hoping that everything is good before, you know, he, you know, was born, came to the world came through the birth process. But, you know, like that stress that's on your head, that he was also our first baby. So obviously it was my first experience, but, you know, like that stuff plays on your head a little bit. And then when do you have time to sort of, what's the word, the follow through of the actual event happening? I'm not going to call it trauma, I'm not going to call it PTSD, but it's very similar in that regard, right? And Malik, you said you know some things on this, so maybe you want to shed some light while I pause there, and I'll go through some more after that.
And you were just starting to touch on that topic. There's so much research on women's postpartum depression, and I think it's very important because, like you said, that whole process of giving birth, there's a lot of hormonal and biological changes, which is
Physical
very
things.
valid
Yeah.
and very
Yeah.
important. What I love about what you talked about is with men now, the research in the past few years has been emerging that, hey, men's postpartum depression also is actually a thing. If we think of from a biological standpoint, it's not as like as extreme as a woman experience as giving birth,
Of course
but
not.
there's also other factors, like you said. It's that pressure to be a dad that adds to that mental health aspect. It's um, there's depending on the situation, you're with your partner, that's a one-on-one situation. Now you've added another human in your life, so building that bond with a whole nother person, that's also important.
Yeah.
And also, you've kind of touched on it a little bit, it's like that element of guilt. It was like, hey, like everybody keeps asking about
Everybody else.
but like nobody's asking about me. Like then you feel bad that you're like, why is nobody asking about me? But
Yeah.
I should just be a dad and I'll be fine.
I
But
honestly
then
experienced this, and it just like, it's not like I was thinking that I want to be asked about. It was just during the process. It was like, kind of like, it was just while it was unraveling, I'm like, yo, nobody's asking about me. Like, this wasn't easy for me. Clearly, I was the least of the three individuals, being me, my wife, and my son, that needed any sort of care in that regard. But after it was all set and the dust settled and everything, it was just like, nobody still cares. Like, I'm trying to, manage everything and hold everything together. There's also a lead up before a baby's born. It's like getting things ready, right? And it's not just guys who do this. Like, if you took a look at the traditional mother and father, male female example, who are expecting a child, often both of them are getting involved in getting things ready for baby to come, building a crib, child proofing certain things. But sometimes, often men who are in this traditional setting don't want the woman to do heavy lifting and stuff, obviously, because they're pregnant, right? So there's like a buildup of, dudes. Kush, you guys came over and helped me build the crib and stuff before it happened, and we're just trying to get ready. You remember how many I spent, like a month just trying to get things ready, month and a half, 2 months, just going to IKEA, lifting stuff, running around, making sure things were ready. I wanted to have everything ready. If you look at the typical 9 months for baby to be formed, to be born, I tried having everything ready by like before the middle of the 8th month, just in case, right? And that itself is stressful. Then you settle down for a minute, you're like, whew, and boom, baby's here, right? And then you got that again. And so there's like these little rise and fall emotions of stress and a little bit of fear, like making sure you're good to go. Like, am I ready? Is my house ready? And especially with the first child, I mean, a lot of people who are parents out there will probably know, like with the first one, it's not a guinea pig situation at all, but it's your first experience, no matter what you hear. And again, here's another sort of reverse or other side of the spectrum here, but women are always one who are told, "Iddan karna, tusi iddan," you got to do this, make sure you do this, make sure you do this, make sure you do this for yourself so that you can do this for the baby. And it's never hardly any wisdom. Well, I had never heard any.
I think, yeah, and that's touching on a really important point of that mental health aspect. Like you said, there's those ups and downs. Like, they're not necessarily bad ups, and they're not like stress and all these things are fine in certain amounts, especially when you're having a whole nother human coming into your life.
Yeah.
If it's from a male perspective or if it's from a female perspective, it's still important to take care and monitor that mental health. I think one piece that I want to tie back into is those support networks. Again, as men, there isn't necessarily that opportunity or that space to talk about, hey, yo, like this having a kid thing, really freaking stressful. Whereas we can see in society, it's a lot more normal for women to have, and I guess in a way, like that's their very big skill. Women are more comfortable talking about their emotion with other women.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of support groups, a lot of networks, a lot of things going on there, but that's where that stigma comes in. It's like, and I think you could probably speak to this, Pat. It's like that feeling of being alone as a male. Like, who do I talk to about this? Like, can I talk to, like, what that struggle as well.
And the other thing is, like, for example, just to give you a little bit of, nothing to knock women, of course, but it's always the women in the maternity wards so in Royal Alec Hospital, for example, here in Edmonton, where I was born, and where my son was born. It's in the women's pavilion, right on top of it, which makes sense because it's a female, process to give birth that way. But at the same time, it's like you're there as a dude surrounded by all these ladies there. I didn't see other dudes there. Some of the guys who came in, during prepping us for the labor, there were some male doctors and stuff, but nurses, the experts, the people that came in, they talked to you about, okay, this is how you do things, this is a baby, okay, check on all these things. There was no guys, and they were always talking to my wife. They were like, how are you doing? And I'm like, dude, she just gave birth, you want to talk to me? Because she doesn't know what's going on at this very second, like literally a minute after. It's like, let her calm down. But at the same time, it was stressful for me in the same regard, but in a different way, right? Obviously I was able to handle things more because I didn't physically just pop a baby out. But yeah, it's a thing, because there's always what do you call those ladies, but there's a lot of female support for females in pregnancies that are optional, like not necessarily doctors, because you can get male or female, but there's like they're called doulas, and they're usually female, and there's these other ones, I forget what they're called. Instead of a doctor or a nurse, you can get them as well. The term will come to me in a minute, but they're usually females that help you with it.
And I think I'm gonna kind of take the conversation and go with that support network. Men don't have that opportunity to talk about their emotions, or it's not normalized. And then when we tag in also that stereotype or the code that men have of just manning up and just handling it, just deal with it, that makes not only, like you've talked about specifically with birth, but any mental health concern. Like if we're stressed, and I'll kind of start talking about my experience. It's like when we deal with this stress, for me, stress has led to me being a very anxious personality. I wear a ring for a reason, because I sit here and just fidget, similar to like Pat's talked about his fidget spinner. I sit here and play with my ring because that's how I keep myself present, or keep myself from not kind of getting too anxious. And for
Pause
me,
for a second. It was a midwife that I was talking about.
There you go.
But I'm just saying. Anyways, go back to your fidgeting here.
And I think for me, the biggest thing about that anxiety was finding those people that I felt comfortable talking about it. And it wasn't like, for the most part, when I started talking about what was going on for me, it wasn't like, this is exactly the reason that's happening, this is what's causing my stress, and it was more so of like, oh, I actually have people that care about me enough to just listen.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about that code of just manning up, I've never really fit that stereotype of a man. I'm not super macho, I'm not handy with anything, and that's a whole identity thing that I've talked a lot about in
as long as you can wrap
episodes.
Cables, you're good.
And I can't do that either, so but that's, and so for me, it was really a struggle of like, I can understand what these emotions are. I can understand that I'm feeling anxious. I can understand that all of these negative racing thoughts are going through my head, and kind of the reasons they're going through it. But it's like, what do I do with them? I'm a man. I cannot talk about this with anybody. So for me, my biggest breakthrough was actually finding, and it was you, Pat, and a couple of others that were like, oh, okay, these people are here to listen to me. All they do is listen. But for me, that was that door that opened my opportunity to continue and start my actual mental health journey, and understand that, hey, it's okay to have feelings, period, as a man. But it's okay to talk about these feelings. You're not alone in talking about these feelings. Just obviously, we talk about stats a lot, but they're numbers. 75% of suicides are male. That's a shocking number to me, but before suicide comes the stress, comes the suicidal ideation, comes of all these other things. So I think,
and people aren't aware of these feelings. Like, I mean, let's hear a little bit from Kush too, because his support's there with him in the frame of the camera, the bear. But I mean, Kush, you want to add anything else? Like, how have you experienced things? One thing I'm going to add that it applies to me and Kush is, along with the men's mental health, especially culturally, I feel like the older brother, if there's many brothers in a family or of a cluster of siblings, often has to be more of the banda than anybody else. And even if it's a female Malik, sometimes the oldest sister gets treated like she's the man of of the future, right? Agree. Of the lineage. So, but Kush, go for it, man. Jump in a little bit.
Well, I don't really know what necessarily to touch on, because it's so broad, and you guys have kind of touched on quite a few different things. But
well, just jump in, like, even like, with seeing me as a dad or something, like, or whatever you want. But it's whatever you feel like, because you've been a watcher in terms of my life. You've seen me struggle with a lot of men when they don't do this, things like that.
But like all the norms and you're talking about, they're real, right? Like it is what it is. Like that's how it is for guys. Like, and it's a reality at the end of the day. And then the thing is, it's like we also as guys will push that reality forward because we play into those stereotypes that were laid out for us. And then we play into that mindset where it's like, no, I gotta push through, man. I'm a guy. I'm the man. I gotta do this, right? So like we do those things to ourselves as males, and it's not like specifically like a culture or anything. I think this is just widespread throughout like a societal thing, right? Especially Western society, because mental health is it hits pretty hard over here. I think I think if you look at other parts of the world, it's maybe not as impactful because what they focus on in life is quite a bit different, and what's valuable to people in different parts of the world is different than us here on the Western side. And yeah, like for me, it's your typical male stuff, right? Like your typical cookie cutter kind of things that I do see every day. Like even if you just greet somebody, it's like is that really, are you really just like, hey, hi, how's it going, right? Like typical stuff like that, like small talk. Like to me, sometimes that stuff's meaningless as well, because there's no substance behind that, and I like to be a substance-based person. Otherwise I just feel like it's a little bit of a waste of a time. Obviously, depending on the scenario, if you don't know the person, then it's a little different. But yeah, like in my life, I've had a few people that I would go to, but it's always hard. There's always stuff that I keep to myself. Like I won't share it with anyone, just because like I feel like, no, I have to figure this out myself, or whatever it is. That's and I would like, and like I can agree or acknowledge like that's not healthy, right? But at the same time, it's like that kind of male mentality where it's like, but I have to figure it out, right? Otherwise, like, oh, I'm weak or something, or then I'm like, I'm not much of a man, but like, oh, you can say like, oh, it's a failure, right? Or Malik just commented like, yeah, the feeling of being a burden, right? So that's also a thing too, especially like in a family dynamic. If you don't feel like you're contributing or something, right? Especially as a guy with being Punjabi. Now this is culture specific, where guys are expected to, kind of provide and run the households and those sorts of stuff.
Do things, do work.
Yeah, literally do the whole upkeep of the house, right? Breadwinners traditionally, obviously, right?
All the karda come fixing the house. Like, girls can do it, but it's always.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. It's changing obviously as we go on, and modernize a little bit, as people would say. But times change and things do change and gender roles change, but it's still there, right? Those norms are still there for guys. Those norms are still there for girls. Yeah, and then when the cultural aspect spins a lot, it just adds to it, really. So I don't know, like it's hard to deal with. Like it's really just those one-on-one conversations. I feel like they help quite a bit. Or when you want to just say something, just saying it, even if the person's not even like giving you something in return in terms of like advice, because Um, that stuff
Just listening.
doesn't help
Yeah.
as well either. Like sometimes when you get advice from people, it's actually not, I find it not helpful. I find it, my experience personally, I've only found one person who was ever related to me in this entire world. Like, and anytime I've spoken to them, and that was a very rare moment. So it's weird because it's like, I don't know what to attribute that to. And in terms of like, it's my expectations on like if I'm reaching out to somebody and what to hear back from them. It could be something like that. I don't know. But like it also at the same time feels good sometimes just to say shit and just like kind of just get it off the chest. And then you feel lighter for sure. I do.
And I think,
or I have.
and I'm gonna tag in a Punjabi saying here again. I know it's been a very cultural heavy episode, but manu halka karna, right? It's just, and it's often said in kind of the mental health field that you don't necessarily have to give advice. If you just talk or be present for that individual, that has a massive impact. Kind of how Kush said, it's just getting it off your chest makes you a little bit more comfortable about talking about it. Eventually, maybe, hopefully, you get to a point where you are more comfortable talking to that individual and those conversations become more normal. Those conversations become more normal, not only with the two people, but in your friend circle and growing and building from there. Another piece I think is important that we've kind of, it also, we talked a little bit about it with the cultural aspect, but it's those coping strategies and understanding how to manage different aspects of mental health. Like Kush talked about, there are some pieces where we don't want to share. We're not ready to share. We're not comfortable sharing, and that's okay. But it's also knowing like there's some pieces that if I share it, it's not the end of the world, but there's ways to manage and cope with the ups and downs. And it's kind of staying in that area where we're in that window of tolerance where we feel comfortable managing that mental health. If we get too high or we get too low, that's when things kind of go astray. And Himit also agrees with what I'm saying here. It's making sure that we stay within that window of tolerance of, hey, if I get too upset or too depressed, or if I get too stressed out, or if I get too anxious, that's when things kind of go awry. So talking with friends, breaking that stigma of that support network is one piece of the puzzle, but another big piece of that puzzle is that those coping strategies and knowing what healthy coping strategies are. If we talk about culture, and Pat alluded to this a little bit earlier, in the Punjabi culture, drinking, huge, it's just a norm. Like, oh, okay, like, and if we talk about substance use in general, not only alcohol, but a lot of other substances are a very, very common coping strategy for men because they don't know how to either talk about their emotions or deal with their emotions. So often,
and there's not a lot of examples sometimes in their life either, right? Like, because it like with the indigenous community that Amarjit Sohi referred to with residential schools, it's a generation pass on of trauma going down and down and down. So it happens in a lot of cultures, in fact, but obviously that was a very specific thing that was incited by the government. But with like Punjabi community, like, it's all good, you're a man, deal with it. Then you say that to your son. Like if I teach that to him, he's going to teach that to his kids or whatever, right? And the other thing that we do in the Punjabi community is like, here, just drink your sorrows away. And it's good, it works for him because he can only drink a bottle, but you know what I mean. It in fact happens a lot in our community.
And we kind of downplay that, and
even as Canadians, right? Drink a beer. Yeah. Like, it's just.
If I could throw a stat out there, this is very specific to Western Canada. In British Columbia, males accounted 81% of drug overdose deaths in 2020 in BC were males. And I think that number, obviously there's other factors involved with that drug overdose, but a lot of it can relate to mental health and being okay with managing that mental health and understanding where we stand or how we're doing with that. So coping strategies, I know, is really important. If you talk to any kind of mental health therapist or anybody in the mental health field, it's like, talk about your emotions, even if it's with yourself, right? If you're journaling, or you've seen things that have become really popular nowadays in pop culture of gratitude journal, gratitude jars, things like that, inciting, finding ways to, because especially with COVID was such a negative cloud over all of our heads, no matter how good or how bad our mental health was. It affected us more than we realize sometimes. So being able to cultivate, or being able to begin to cultivate positives, if it's gratitude, if it's coping strategy, if it's friends, whatever it is, I think is also a really important piece of that mental health puzzle, men or any gender.
My issue with the whole resource availability in the cultural scheme of things is that it's not there. When you're young, you're learning about these things, and you might need something like that. Now, if you look at our spaces, primary space for like a Punjabi, maybe Sikh fellow or feller would probably be Gurdwara, right? Or like those cultural centers or something. Now, there's a severe lack of, I'd say, professionals, mental health professionals, psychologists, whatever it is, behavioral therapists, whatever. And it, to aid culturally, or to be there, be like, hey, if you need help, you can contact this person. There might be a few in the community, and now there definitely is more coming in as our generation's growing, or the generation even below us. But that availability was never there. So it was never like, because for us, it was always like, just deal with it, right?
But
and that lack of resource, I think, also has made a habit for folks to not rely on them or even turn to them now. Because also everyone here is like, oh, there's help available, but it's not really,
you don't
clear
know
cut
where
as
to go.
that.
Yeah.
And it's not encouraged. Like they'll say it generally, but they won't encourage.
It's so general, and then when you're trying to look through it, and you already are, it's already hard to do, for example, like then it's even more discouraging, especially if you don't know where to go from there. It's kind of like a hands-off process in a sense.
They kind of like, people will just be like, hey, you can go and do this, and they'll just leave you.
But I think, and if we're tagging that cultural piece in, we talked about it last week in our Bugs and Drug episode of our parents trying to look out for the best for us. It's like they say this, but then they're also like, they have no idea what this mental health aspect is, because for them it was something totally different. So now we have the resources.
It's not even a thing for them.
Yeah, and I
They're
talked
like, what
about,
are you talking about?
Yeah,
but in some cultural aspects, just to jump in, if you look at generations back, like obviously we're a generation of Canadian-born Punjabi, kids, right? But there's a generation that came from Punjab or India or where other parts.
Even now, like we talked about students, similar situation.
Like this guy's from here, but a lot of elders, you'll see that they come here, their families bring them here. And back in the day when times were simpler and, not so, I guess you can say, because our time right now, where it's a high stress time, there used to be that sort of center in the village with that tree, the sort of central place where a lot of people sat and chilled and talked. And a lot of that was their mental therapy right there. Right. So, I mean, I'm going to mute my mic for a second, but we can continue from there. I just wanted to say that.
And the thing that I always talked about on the radio as well was the language. If we're talking about different generations, and that's a big piece of our podcast of being children of immigrants, we talk about depression, we talk about anxiety, we talk about all these textbook mental health illnesses. But when we talk about it with our parents or other generations, they're like, I don't understand and I'm going to tag in the Punjabi language because that's what I'm most familiar with. Anxiety. What is the word for anxiety in Punjabi? It's not, but that's the adjective. It's describing, like chinta, घबराहट हुंदी है. But that doesn't necessarily encompass completely what anxiety can be, or depression, like, oh, man udas hai. Okay, but that still doesn't encompass what depression can be for some individuals, the actual biological, the actual physical, the actual mental changes that happen in a severe state. And I think, Pat, you talked about this, it's a different environment that we're in now, different generation. And our parents are definitely going through a lot of mental health struggles. A lot of parents that have come here, a lot of students that are here now, they have a whole other set of concerns that have come up, but they don't know how to talk about it. And I think that is the language piece is a huge piece, tying in with Kushi's like resources. Like the language doesn't exist. So how can we access those resources, and how can those resources be valuable to us if we don't know how to or what to talk about.
Yeah. I
And
don't know, like you know, that's like that. I feel like that's been like such a frustrating piece as well. Like, and not even just culturally, like Punjabi culture, like even just in the normal Western society too. I still feel like that's a barrier, and even finances are a barrier as well. Because it said like, hey, you can do this or that or whatever, but it's still hard to access stuff because you still have to pay for some services, and depending on like if you're covered or if you have insurance or whatever, some stuff you can't go and access, right?
Yeah.
And then the other aspect in terms of language, if you're gonna go see somebody who's like a, you know, like a Canadian born fellow who's like white, for example, they're not gonna understand where you're coming from with your background, and how your upbringing was, because your household was totally different than what they're used to. And those things matter when you're trying to understand the whole scope of a scenario and a situation, right? Um, so those things, like in terms of accessibility to like who you're trying to get help from and stuff, and then that language that's being used, like those things are, I think, a challenge as well.
Yeah, and just keeping an eye on time, I want to kind of take an opportunity to spin this into a positive, because there's a lot of struggles, and one podcast, one conversation isn't going to change the stigma, if it's with mental health in general or if it's with men's mental health in general. Things like Movember, things like Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, things like breaking the silence, and or talking with your buddy on the driveway. And we've all kind of experienced that, sitting in the car, sitting in the driveway. Those heart-to-heart conversations those hit a lot different than, hey, just checking in. But
Those are usually the best ones.
what are those next steps for us? Like, how can you get help and how can you help? I think those, if we're kind of taking an opportunity to create a space to talk about mental health, I think that is also a very important thing that we should talk about. It's like, what can we do? We've kind of alluded to a little bit of, it's like, hey, just be an ear or find an
But
ear.
I
Like,
think also we have to kind of, as a society, like we can say it here, like this can be that preaching moment that we just referred to, a few moments ago, but like really, like you have to be there for your friends and say, hey, it's okay, like I can talk to you or you can talk to me. And it starts with one friend, and they can then learn that it's okay. And maybe they don't know that, maybe they've had nobody to ever tell them that it's okay. And like just genuinely be there, and maybe somebody just needs you to listen. Maybe they don't need advice. Maybe they just need, because you might think like, oh, I don't know what to do for this person, but maybe you just need to listen to them and hear what's going on. And maybe you don't know what to do, but maybe later in life you stumble on something that might be able to help them in a situation,
also,
right?
but also even to that point, it's like maybe they just needed somebody to talk to. And I'll tag in your experience, Pat, of like, hey, I feel kind of alone right now in dealing with this birth. If you had somebody to listen to, like nobody giving you advice, just somebody to listen to, that would have been a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
And
And I can attest to knowing how it is to have somebody to listen to you, like somebody in my family, an elder, who we don't have anymore. So I've experienced that. And then it's also, there's another little thing is sometimes we lose people in our family and support, that who used to be your sort of soundboard, and then they're gone. So that's a whole other spectrum. But at the same time, where can you, if you lose somebody, it could be a friend that you're not friends with, it could be your ex-girlfriend's brother, who obviously now you're not dating, so you can't. Anyway, there could be so many different situations. So I think it's good to have like support people, not just one person, but it starts with one person for sure. And sort of, I think as guys, we have to understand that other guys, potentially cousins, brothers, teammates, friends, classmates,
everybody's
whatever.
going through it.
Pardon? Yeah, everybody's going through
everybody's
it one
going
way or
through it.
another. Exactly. And it's mental health is just like you said, Malik. It's everybody has it because you have a brain, you're feeling things, you're thinking things, you're experiencing things. So it may not, mental health doesn't always mean it's a negative thing. Like it often people think of mental health, that means no, you could have good mental health. You could be having a great time and that's your mental health. But nobody talks about those moments either. Like, I had so much fun. And they talk about that, but it's when they're not good that they don't talk about it. So that's where that shame or fear or whatever comes
Guilt
in.
and yeah. that
Guilt,
feeling
yeah,
of
that's a
burden.
good word for it too. Yeah.
And kind of the other side of the equation, the other side of the coin is if you feel like, hey, this buddy of mine is kind of
A little
quiet,
quiet lately.
or like he's doing something, like something seems off, just check in, like a phone call, a text, like, hey, what's up? And Kush talked about this, is like, be genuine in it. Like, if you're asking, hey, how's it going?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're gonna be genuine in it.
And don't make it
that,
just one of those like greeting questions. Like just actually ask, like actually.
but also if you're reaching out, you're being genuine. You're asking, hey, how's it going? And that'll come through. If that friend's like, oh, he's just asking about, but they'll notice that, hey, they're actually checking in and making sure I'm okay. It again, talking about suicide, it's very common in the mental health field of like, talking about it doesn't trigger the individual to follow through. Talking about it opens a door for them to talk about it and share their feelings, because oftentimes that, like we've talked about, the emotions that are involved underneath, those are there, it creates space for them to be explored. So that feeling of being alone.
It's kind of like taking a load off, right? Like if you're carrying all these boxes and it's getting hard to carry because it's heavy, it can be similar with mental thoughts and feelings. Like sometimes just, putting that weight down, it comes in the form of just talking about it with somebody, or even just writing about it, just getting it out,
even
and
to yourself,
getting it out to somebody listening, or to a piece of paper, or, you might even do a voice recording and then listen to it later. It helps. Anything. Some people, it's an old school technique. It's a very old school thing, and they go outside and they talk to the stars, and no hidden message there, guys, but they'll talk to the stars about how they're feeling. And that's not a well, if you just put it on the screen.
Just click the link up there. We're not going to say anything else.
Had to put a little bit of stress relief in there for a moment, but for real, like some people actually talk to the stars. They'll just go outside, gaze at the stars, and they'll just talk. And
but
sometimes
those are the coping, right? That's nature. And I think Cushy, you can talk to this, like that nature piece for you is huge.
But before I let it go to Kush here, I'm just going to say one last thing. You don't always have to talk or write about it. Sometimes you just need space and the lack of noise to just think about it and process it. And that's often sometimes a good place to start. Like sometimes you just need to have, maybe in a noisy environment, or work is chaotic, or you just can't get away from things. If you can find a minute to get away, or even just go for a drive and grab some McDonald's and sit in the parking lot, just think about how you're feeling, and sometimes
I'll frame it.
Can do it.
I'll add to that a little bit as well. It's like, oftentimes with all of the things that we're dealing with, if we're men, if we're other genders, we have stuff on our plate, and that's completely normal. But oftentimes, like, things keep building up and building up and building up, and then we get to a point where, like, the smallest thing, the most insignificant thing, is going to cause us to react in a way that we're like, oh, that's not how I would normally react to this, but I'm pissed off. Anger is a secondary emotion that we see outwardly, but there's also stuff underneath it that's causing that anger to come out.
It's that age-old saying, it's the straw that broke the horse's back, right?
Yeah. And the one metaphor that I love to use in my own personal life as well, it's thinking of ourselves having a bucket. This bucket has a bunch of spoons in it, and our responsibilities are taking those spoons out of our bucket. So, like,
you said this before in the podcast, and I've said before as well, the first thing I think about is a Gurdwara Langar Hall.
That's the bucket.
That's the bucket.
I follow this so deeply that I'm considering getting a tattoo of it. That's how much I believe in this kind of spoons in a bucket thing. It's like, we have responsibilities, and those things are going to take spoons out of our bucket, and that's okay. But we also have to find ways to recharge or add spoons to our bucket. If it's talking with our friends, Manu halka karna hai, that's going to add a spoon to our bucket. If it's going for a walk in nature, going on a drive, grabbing some McDonald's, that adds a spoon to our bucket. So then, if things go terribly, or if we're constantly dealing with this mental health, we stay within that window that we can manage these things. We can manage that mental health, similar to how we manage our physical health. Like, if we have a nagging injury, if we have a knee injury, I'm not going to go for a 10K run. I'm going to find a different way to deal with it, and then continue managing my physical health. So
yeah, I think you're talking like ideal scenarios here. Like, something not so ideal is, I think it's okay not to engage in conversation and support people if
Mhm.
you yourself don't have the capacity to do so.
That's a good point.
That's not something we touched on, but I think it's important because like I've gone to the point where it's just like I can't even deal with your stuff because my stuff is just too much.
And I think that's very fair.
Yeah, and like so in the ideal scenario, you want to be able to help, you want people to obviously help you or hear you out, or you return the favor to, not even return the favor, just support somebody however you can. But there's going to be instances where you might just be so tapped out or not in tune with whatever's going on that you can't intake anymore, or you might not be able to have the capacity to outpour anything right in those certain moments. And I think like I just want to say like that's fine too.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think as long as you can voice it to that person so they understand that, you know, you're going through some stuff too, just even that in an ideal situation.
But like like even if the moment, if you can't,
in the
sometimes
moment,
you have to
for
kind
sure,
of like you have to do what you got to do for yourself sometimes in that spot, and then hopefully afterwards it can kind of be like smoothened out or whatever, right?
For sure,
I'm
for
gonna tag
sure.
in, yeah, I'm gonna tag in another metaphor here because I love using metaphors. It's when we're sitting on a plane and the instructions and the safety thing are, hey, put your oxygen mask on first before you help other people. And I think, Kush, that's a very important point that we're touching on. It's like, as we're navigating what mental health is for us, because I think that is kind of a starting point for a lot of people that are listening right now, and for me personally as well. It's like, what is mental health to me? Like, how do I take care of it? What are things that I can do, and how can I push my boundaries, and where can I not push my boundaries? Like, there's some, like you said, Kush, like some days I can't deal with this, so I need to take care of myself, and that's also tagging in the emotion of guilt. Like, that's okay as well.
Yeah, true that.
So as always, we like to talk about, and we've done a lot with our bugs and drugs, of just creating that space to talk about certain topics. This is the conclusion of season 1. As we talked about in our last episode, we'll be taking about a month break here. Make sure you keep it plugged into our socials at Pardesi _beats on Instagram and Twitter to see what we're up to, because although we're not going to be releasing episodes, we'll be definitely putting out some content for you folks to be keeping an eye out for season 2. If there's anything that you guys want to talk about, want us to talk about, make sure you slide into our DMs and let us know.
Yeah, so having said that, we will still be working. You just won't be hearing from us. It was a good season, guys. I think you know, as we were uploading and creating the content, because the one thing I do want to say to kind of cap the season off is we had a very interesting start to the season because we plug got pulled, right? So we pulled the plug from being on radio and in the 2 forms we were on radio in multiple ways, and being one in me and you, Malik, and then the other way with Kush and Simran was with Pardesi Beats Power Play. So we had a few things going, and you know, with sometimes things don't work out, or you know, paths don't continue to go down this, they divide, and so we unplugged. And we're here with you guys on YouTube and on any podcast, all the podcast platforms that you can think of right off the top of your head. But one thing I want to say towards the end here is, you know, some episodes were serious, some were funny, some were about sports. So we didn't have like a real big theme, but the general theme was like, you know, we are tapped in with this sports community. We're identifying with all these things. This is a part of my identity. Cushy loves Liverpool, and that's a problem. I love Man United, and that's great. But the thing is, like, a lot of it was circling around identity. And often when you listen to us on the radio as well, perhaps in the past, and if you're a new listener or viewer and you didn't know about the radio thing, then that's cool too. Let us know in the comments if you're one of those people. But you know, even on there, a lot of the Pardesi Beats name in itself is based off of somebody who's left their place of origin and found some beats, which was music, which is also an identity thing, or a reflection or extension of identity. So I think identity is a great sort of theme. And we implore you to, if you want to and have time, to revisit old episodes and comment any suggestions you have. We want to make season 2 a little bit more focused, but at the same time, we don't want to lose what our identity is and continue to do what we have been doing. But the biggest thing with me, at least as a radio host, was I used to ask my listeners, right? Malik, you do this too. Like, you know, how you guys like the show? Let me know. I used to say, tweet me, let me know. And in this case, you can tweet us, but you can also just comment below or whatever. And if there's anything we're missing, or you feel that should be good for a topic, we're not closed to it. we're open to it. So definitely let us know.
Yeah, and kind of in closing, just thanks to everybody that stuck with us from the radio onto this new platform. Like Pat said, it was a learning opportunity for us as well.
Yeah.
Radio is a whole different beast compared to podcasts and
Yeah.
YouTube. So thank you for all of the love and all the support that you have given us over this season. And hopefully we'll be back better than ever in season 2.
See you in the next one.